Hi, I'm Tom Hendrickson from the Devops Online Summit, and welcome to our keynote interview with Nirmal Mehta. Nirmal, introduce yourself to the people here at the Devops Online Summit.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nirmal Mehta. I'm a distinguished engineer at Booz Allen and a Docker captain, and I'm excited here today to talk to you all about moving security to the left to achieve compliance as fast as possible, right, in our busy lives. I'm I'm a distinguished engineer, and I focus on emerging technology, cloud architecture, DevOps. Love that whole entire space. I'm a big proponent of containerization and the cultural change to achieve digital transformation in organizations. Pleasure to meet you, Tom.
Excellent. Now that you touched on a lot there, but to kind of get us started, your title for this session, as you kind of alluded to a little bit there, is Sec DevOps, Lessons from Shifting Security to the Left to Increase Speed to Compliance. So what do you mean by that, Nirmal?
Yeah, so a lot of our industries that we work in are regulated in some kind of capacity, have to go through some kind of compliance frameworks or compliance checks. I primarily support the public sector, which is, compliance central for all intents and purposes, but there are other industries as well, as your audience is probably working in these days. And the idea behind this talk is providing some lessons learned and some takeaways around how you can ease the burden or ease the pain, so the supposed pain of compliance, the compliance process in your own organization, and how to kind of achieve the main output or outcome of DevOps is increasing velocity or the quality and reliability of your software and your systems, and how to do that with this thing that's hanging over everyone's head, this thing called compliance, right? And how to relieve that tension between those two kind of worlds. And that's the primary topic I'd love to talk with you today around is some lessons learned on how to achieve that.
Yeah, that's really good. And I like what you're doing there with that title, Nirmal, about shifting left, because I guess a lot of times people think of that, and I guess they think about testing, because I know a lot of people talk about that. And I know that's obviously in a lot of Gene Kim's work. But I like how you kind of took that and said, okay, let's use that and use that for compliance as well. So talk to us a little bit about how that would work, and maybe how those relate a little bit, like with security as well.
Yeah. So what I meant with that title is we have to think about security as foundational. Mm-hmm. If we want to achieve speed, velocity, or whatever the outcomes that your organization has a North Star for their DevOps or the DecSecOps transformation, you have to think about security not at the end, which is typical organization. You
Yes.
No matter how much testing you have and all that good stuff, you make your apps, you make your microservices, you make your whatever, and then you get it into like the production state with the firewall turned on, and then the compliance team comes in and says, okay, here's your Excel sheet. Go down the next 950 controls and tell us how you are meeting these, right? And we laugh, but the world is changing dramatically with respect to cybersecurity right now. We can no longer rest on our laurels around cybersecurity. It's really bad. Let's just be honest. Like it's a really fast moving, hostile world in terms of IT and cybersecurity. And even this past 2021, just in the past 3 months, with the SolarWinds and with the Exchange hack, that just occurred like a week ago, as of this recording. I mean, these are huge things, and I think just today there was another OpenSSL, not critical vulnerability, but severe vulnerability released, right? So, we can't, compliance isn't just about checking boxes.
Yeah.
And I know that's like cliche, it kind of feels like that, and it is sometimes like that, but it's
Mm-hmm.
I want to kind of discuss how we can kind of turn that conversation around and make it fundamental to what you're trying to achieve with DevOps.
Yeah.
And I think in this day and age, baking security in as an afterthought at the end of the process, or security with respect to achieving compliance at the end of a process, is a road to nowhere right now.
Yeah.
And it just leads to suffering on everyone. The compliance people are not going to be happy. The security people aren't going to be happy. The devs and sysadmins aren't. No one's happy, right?
Nope. Yeah.
And so, to kind of circle back to testing, I mean, testing is an appropriate way to think about security in a sense. I think testing is a function that you can do with security, and that's ideal, right? And we'll get to that in a couple of minutes, hopefully. But the idea around security is, or moving security to the left, is around focusing on three main things. The first one is empathy, right? Understanding what is the security, your CISO, your security organization, concerned about? What are they trying to achieve? What are their fears? What are their goals? And aligning the overall DevOps process, cultural and tooling, to meet those incentivizing toward those goals. And security says no because they're in a position of, let's be honest, fear, right? I mean, we just talked about this hostile world out there. The natural reaction for a lot of people is no, right? And we have to shift that conversation, and shifting that conversation, bringing security in as a foundational part of the initial process. If it's a greenfield or a new, application migration or a new digital transformation effort, bring them into the conversation, understand their fears. What are their risk tolerances? What are they like? What are they looking out for? And have those tough discussions and conversations early on, with a point of view of empathy and a shared goal of, at the end of the day, we need to still deliver these services, right? With the least amount of compromise as possible. No pun intended. The second part is, a focus on infrastructure as code. I think a lot of folks in the DevOps Online Summit are going to focus on infrastructure as code. It's a big thing, right? I think the security industry, the IT security tooling industry, has been a laggard with respect to adopting infrastructure as code or automation around their tooling. And so that second kind of pillar here is focusing on, when you're having those discussions with the security team, focusing on tooling that is inherently automatable, right? Has configuration elements that can be stored as infrastructure as code, and ideally is stored with the configuration of that is stored with that service or with whatever entity makes sense within the structure of your applications or your services. And the third part is really understanding how compliance fits into this picture. So, security and compliance, they're often conflated, but they're separate things, right? There's some kind of Venn diagram one can draw where, compliance is a subset of security, or security is a subset of compliance. Really understanding what is meant by the compliance process, what is meant by being compliant, and tying that early on to the tooling and the processes and the understanding of what the entities are and the assets that you're trying to achieve in your architecture is really important, and have that way early on in your architectural discussions. And that also means gone are the days where you put on the to-do list, we'll get to TLS later on, right? Let's just build our app like MVP, and we'll turn on encryption of data later, and we'll figure out secrets later, and let's just put it right now. Just put the database password in the Git repo. We'll figure it out later, right? Or let's just do HTTP because I don't want to have to deal with certificates and self-signed certs. No, those days are gone. In this day and age, there's enough tooling in place, and it is, it's a little bit painful, but there's enough tooling in place with things like Let's Encrypt and Kubernetes and containerization and all that other magical stuff that you have to put that stuff on at the onset.
Yeah.
It's only going to be more painful later. And so understanding that what's the set of things in your architecture that will probably, that likely cover 80% of the compliance things that they're looking for, right? I mean, honestly, if you encrypt in transit, encrypt in rest, you're probably covering like a good chunk of common compliance frameworks. And then, there's some other tooling around there in terms of visibility, observability, and other things where you're chipping away. And you can find things that cover massive swaths of whatever frameworks and checklists and Excel sheets that you have to do later on. And they'll be much happier if they see that. And ideally, if you wrap all three of these pillars together, you'll get to a state where the compliance framework is related to the security tooling, which is related to infrastructure as code that's sitting next to your service and that is accessible by all the stakeholders, by your security team, by your compliance auditing team, by your testing team. And there's a shared responsibility around those configuration elements. And that's the ideal state, right?
Yeah.
There's no scapegoats in a place where everyone can see in the Git repo where the configuration of that service's security profile is stored, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's aware. So that's the ideal state. I mean, I've been in organizations where, there's security enforcement on the devs with respect to their apps, but they can't see the Nessus scans or they can't see the vulnerability reports. They don't have access to those tools. How are you going to grade the developers on something they don't even know what the criteria is, right? Of course, they're going to import, Java star like NPM modules if they don't know like what the report says not for them not to do, right?
Yeah.
That's thankfully changing, and with containerization and being able to scan those things, that conversation, that loop around DevOps, security, is starting to close. And so, those excuses are kind of dwindling away, I think, over time. Long answer.
Yes. No, that's true. That's true. I like, though, where you start with empathy and kind of understanding. I think that's so important. I am a technologist as well, and I sometimes see myself and others, we get enamored with tools first. We think, tools will fix, but we need to kind of come back as you focus us on that empathy and understanding the business or who our partners are and understanding. And that's so important, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one has to establish understanding to be able to move forward, right?
Yeah.
I mean, right now, a lot of IT organizations, and I hope this is something we can change as an industry, but right now the default is a defensive position, right?
Yep.
It's a scary world out there. There's data leaks, there's vulnerabilities, there's a lot of moving pieces. And frankly, with all the tooling around DevOps and containerization and Kubernetes, it's even more complex, right? It does allow for more visibility in terms of security and understanding of one's infrastructure and being able to quickly adapt and create repeatable units of assets, I guess you could say, or repeated units of delivery, which goes a long way to achieving better security. But it's also at the cost of introducing a lot more complexity and tooling that, frankly, the education level across the industry and for the security organizations is a lot lower than one would like, right? So the idea behind empathy is understanding that, they might not understand what all these moving pieces that you want to bring into your new greenfield application deployment or your application transformation, right? Like maybe you're migrating something to containers or to Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Like the odds of like your security organization, which is responsible for, all kinds of other things, patching Exchange servers and making sure that people aren't clicking phishing emails and making sure that, their AWS bill, like S3 buckets aren't open to the world, right? Like there's a lot on their plate. So empathy is a way to like, okay, what are, have that conversation around what are the top 5 risks
Yep.
that you are really worried about here. And maybe because I know, say I'm a developer or a DevOps lead, or not a DevOps lead, but like a solution architect, right? Or
Yep.
a system architect, I can have that conversation about risk with the security team. Ideally, I would have a resource dedicated from that team to be sitting there with me in the solutioning. If that's not possible, I would use empathy to, be in their shoes, get an understanding of what they're looking for,
Yep.
and then start to put that into the architecture and make sure it's not an afterthought later on. That's the place where you can start with the the compromise, right? So, engineering is all about trade-offs, right? So maybe initially I can't do XYZ things, but I do have an understanding that those are risks, and I have a plan to address those at certain parts or phases of this project, right?
Yep.
That's what I meant by empathy. It's really aligning the incentives to get out of the defensive position into a more like shared responsibility frame of mind, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
It requires both bottom up and top down. I think CISOs need to understand that they need to embed, security resources into the major DevOps initiatives or within those application development teams. And at the same time, it's bottom up where, developers, operations folks can't just think about security as someone else's responsibility, right?
Yes.
Like this is, at the end of the day, it's all pain relief if we can avoid, security vulnerability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that helps everyone in the organization. And it's not just security vulnerabilities, it's also having a frame of mind around security first, right? So that's what I meant by empathy.
Yeah. Very good. Now you also brought up infrastructure as code, Nirmal. How can we kind of bring that in and leverage that it's a tool, but yet how can we make sure it, aligns with our security needs?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're having those, say you have an awesome CISO and you've got a dedicated security resource, security engineer on your team,
Mm-hmm.
You're doing your solution architecting, right? And you want to align the incentives. Well, the first thing you're going to talk about is tools because everyone wants to go to the easy stuff first, right? Let's talk about the security tooling, right? We got like Twistlock and we got, Falco and we got like Inspec and we got all these like, all these cool whiz bang things.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the North Star risks, right? That we established doing those empathetic conversations.
Yeah.
What tooling, what's the minimum set of things? Because you don't want to introduce,
Too much.
You don't want to build a tank if you don't need a tank yet, right?
Yes.
Like you don't want armor everywhere.
Yeah.
So what is the minimum set of things that cover the mouse amount of ground in terms of tooling? And when you're looking at that tooling, does that tooling support storing the configuration of those elements as infrastructure as code? Mm-hmm. Now, not everything in that tool needs to be stored as infrastructure as code. But the thing that applies, whatever the policies are or the configuration that applies to the asset that is being shepherded through the DevOps process, ideally should be stored as infrastructure as code. And then on top of that, ideally nearby where that service is, right? Mm-hmm. And we can have philosophical debates about the hierarchy of your version control system and where things are. That's fine. The fact that we can have conversations about those things being stored as code is already a big win. And I would say that stuff does not need to be hidden. That should be the shared space where those conversations continue to happen with that security engineer that you have on your team that's helping you out. Like, give them the responsibility for figuring out what the configuration of that element is. And that allows for eventually that infrastructure as code to be automatable through that same DevOps process. So we talked about testing. Well, now you can test that security configuration, right? Yeah. So let's talk about like maybe pod security policies. That should be stored with your container pod YAMLs, right? That should just be another YAML or part of your Helm templates. Mm-hmm. And that those lines in that Helm template should be, the security engineer should have an understanding of what that means. Like that's standardized. Maybe there's parameters there. There's testing you can do to make sure the developer can't change it based off of whatever, right? But it's visible and everyone understands the rules, right? It's very hard to play a game if you don't know what's offsides and what a goal means or what's illegal, right? Like that's not fair to anyone and just causes pain, right? So if a developer knows this is the template that my application is being deployed on, these are the hooks, this is where my secrets are.
Yep.
And ideally, a lot of this stuff is even transparent to the to the service. I mean, you can nowadays with certain tooling, you can have TLS, on by default, and it's completely transparent to the service. You can have encryption at rest, and that's completely transparent to the service. You can have secrets there, and it just looks like environment variables or files, and there's a lot of stuff that you can start to do with the automation is what I'm trying to get at there.
Make it easy.
And you can start testing it, right? And that's the ideal situation. I would imagine if you go to any CISO, having repeatable, testable, security to the left in infrastructure as code that's automated is like nirvana, right? For certain CISOs out there, probably.
Yeah. So, and this all leads, as you mentioned, to kind of to your third takeaway, that we can make this all compliant. This whole system, we kind of shift it in and we bake that compliance in all the way through the process. Yeah, exactly. So if you combine those first two and you get to that infrastructure as code level with your security tooling, then you can get to, and I was just alluding to this, I wouldn't say nirvana state, but a much better spot in terms of security with respect to compliance, because you can attach the compliance checklists. Like, let's be honest, we're not going to get rid of the Excel sheet that has the checkboxes. Yes.
We can link those Excel sheets to a Git repo and a line of code somewhere. I mean, come on, that sounds awesome, right? So if I can say, here's the statement, the system must ensure that, there's encryption in transit, right? Yep. And then you point as your evidence that you're compliant to that statement for your service, you point to a line of code in a Helm chart that says that, I have an Istio configuration that enables strict TLS service mesh, mode for this service. I mean, that's it. Like, that's the state we want to get to. The next level after that is things like GitOps or like reconciliation loops, right? Yep. I mean, this is not new to anyone who's been doing, configuration management, automated configuration management with like things like Chef or Puppet or Ansible for a long time now. But we're getting to the state where we're able to do this with things like GitOps, where the repo becomes the state of truth of what the environment looks like. And there's an automated reconciliation process right there. And you can do these with other tools, Ansible and Chef and others, but you want to get to a point where not only is the compliance box checked off there, not only are you pointing to where in your version control the configuration of that element is stored, but you're also continuously ensuring that that system is compliant to that state that you've identified. And that gets us to the actual at velocity. Compliance at velocity means continuously being compliant. Right. And moving forward toward that, and not making a marker in the sand that says after it's production ready, before you accept public traffic, you go through a 6-month compliance process and then check those boxes once a year or once every 5 years or whatever it is. This is a process where that is a continuous conversation, and that is a continuous thing that just is occurring. And that is ideal, right? Because then you get away from the Excel sheet and everyone's a lot more comfortable with that safety net there, right? Because that code is going through your DevOps pipeline. It can be potentially tested. It's visible by everyone that's a stakeholder, and what the truthful state of the infrastructure is against what you want it to be, right? Yeah. And so that's the ideal, and not kind of skipping over that.
Nirmal, you've shared a lot with us today. Any closing thoughts?
The main closing thought I would purvey is that, lead with empathy first. And it's not just security, but in all the conversations. We live in very stressful times under unprecedented, situations. Everyone is like busy, right? Everyone is trying to adapt to whatever's going on in the world. And we're all just kind of doing our best for the most part. And empathy is a way to kind of cut through that and ensure we don't all rapidly get to a state of suffering, right? So I would say, yeah, and the focus on security in this discussion is because that is often a place of constant consternation in a lot of organizations. And you wouldn't necessarily be in those kind of arguments with your doctor when your doctor is trying to just save you.
Yeah.
The security team is trying to adapt to risk, right? Like they're just trying to shield an organization from risk. And that needs to start with a shared understanding of each other's points of view so you can get out of the instant no. So I ask everyone who's listening to this, start with a little bit of empathy first.
Yes.
And see how far you can get with that.
Yeah. Excellent. Nirmal, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much, Tom. Pleasure having this conversation.
On behalf of Nirmal Mehta, I am Tom Hendrickson for the DevOps Online Summit.